So, hello, greetings. This is Sunday, the 29th of September, and I'm giving my normal weekly address concerning politics and philosophy and ethics. I'll be talking about Brexit and other conflicts going on in the world and other problems. Today's a historic day because it's St. Michael's Day, Archangel Michael in the Christian calendar. It's also Rosh Hashanah in the Hebrew calendar of Judaism. So I'll be commenting on both those in a minute. Firstly, to discuss Brexit, it's been an extraordinary week in British politics, which many people around the world, including myself, have been watching on the Parliament channel and so on. We had the Supreme Court ruling that the prorogation of Parliament was illegal at the beginning of the week on Monday, and then we had the return to Parliament on Wednesday, and we had a couple of days of debates, discussions, Wednesday and Thursday, which I watched in great detail. I wasn't at all impressed by the quality of the Conservative Party's behaviour, particularly Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And I was in fact very disturbed at the continuing intransigence and bull-headed determination to push for his hard Brexit, in spite of the Supreme Court having indicated strongly that it was contrary to law, and that in spite of all common sense really. So I took an initiative in response to all this, which I want to begin by sharing, which has been brewing in me ever since 2015 when I first proposed this. I wrote to the then Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg and David Cameron as a mere philosopher. I'm not a politician, but I do have some views about political reality in the light of philosophy, as I was taught by my mentors and tutors at university, going right back to the time of Plato and Aristotle. It's a duty of philosophers to think about politics and to try rationally and sort out problems. I mean, Aristotle said the duty of philosophy in political thought is to guarantee the happiness of as many people as possible. That remains a bedrock, I think, in political thought. Plato thought even further. It's not just happiness, but it's ultimately the enlightenment of people, because he believed that we're in incarnation as souls in transit through a turbulent and difficult world, and our duty ultimately is to seek passage into a world ultimately of enlightenment. I mean, he was a kind of Western bodhisattva, really. And having achieved enlightenment, as in his great metaphor of the cave, when you come out of the cave and see the broad sun, and don't forget, he's someone who experienced the mysteries at Eleusis, which was the Greek mystery initiation ritual that every sensible person would undergo once in their life, and which guaranteed them the existence of the afterlife. It seems they were given some kind of psychedelic hallucinogen that brought on a near-death experience and then a vision of the afterlife. Plato had that, so he was absolutely convinced in the existence of the afterlife. Aristotle sort of was a bit more hedging around the bets. I'm not sure Aristotle ever did the Eleusis experience. It's a shame, he should have done. And for all we know, in his lost writings, he might have spoken more volubly about the immortality of the soul. He certainly believed in the immortality of the soul, but he never really explains it in depth. Plato does in more detail through the mouthpiece of Socrates, his teacher. And he believed that politics, therefore, should take account of our respective spiritual journeys. And ultimately, the purpose of the state, of society, of governance is to guarantee not just the happiness, but the education, the ongoing move towards enlightenment that we're all actually here for. Keats said the point of human life is, on this planet is a veil for soul making. I love Keats. He's inspired me as a young poet, and thank you, yes. Keats was like a meteor, if you see that wonderful film Bright Star about him. He burst through the world and then was off again. I mean, where did his soul go? If you study reincarnation theory, as I've done, then all these great sages and saints reincarnate, I believe, over many eons, according to laws that we can only just begin to even articulate questions about. The Jains have been thinking about this for centuries, millennia, the Buddhists too, and the Hindus, and the Druids, because they all started from the empirical fact of near-death experiences, soul journeys. And in Plato's wonderful book, The Republic, at the end he puts the myth of which tells the story of the first recorded near-death experience in world history, in detail. And wakes up on a funeral pyre, a soldier, having been about to be burned, dead, and says, no, hang on, I'm alive. And he'd been to the afterlife, he'd been to the Elysian fields, he'd been to the place of judgment, he'd been to the place of the choice of your next life, and so on. He'd seen it all, and he wanted to come back and tell his Athenian friends, fellow citizens, and it's an extraordinary piece of writing. If you haven't read The Myth of the back of Plato's Republic, the whole of the Republic doesn't make sense. I think students should read that first. Okay, so, and yet, here we are in a political world where our statesmen are fighting, they're insulting each other, they're determined on a policy that's going to self-destroy the country. And the people that are doing it who are in power remind me of kind of the thuggery of Athenian politics at its absolute worst. And mob rule, mob democracy, baying for their policy right or wrong. The kind of thing that took them on their stupid expedition to Sicily when thousands of people died. The hotheads, were refusing to listen to common sense. What does one do? Well, according to my analysis, and this was true in 2015 when I first really thought this through, the problem with democratic politics as it's currently set up in the Western world is that politicians have no legal duty to tell the truth in parliaments. They can lie, and politics has become a sort of game of sophisticated lying in order to advance your own career and your own party and your own interests, and to not be caught. And if somebody thinks you're lying, well, you threaten, well, okay, take me to court. And if I'm very wealthy, like Donald Trump, I can hire lawyers and I can shut you up. Or I might, if I'm really corrupt, even have you killed off in secret, as seems to happen from time to time. So essentially, these people who've taken over democracy, I don't regard these people as having the spirit of democracy in them. They're kleptocrats, plutocrats, and totalitarianizers who are stealing democracy from under our noses through their wealth and power and influence. And the control of the media is the key means that they're doing this, because they control what is truth, and so they can then promote their lies as truth. And everything gets turned topsy-turvy, and nobody can hold them to account, because the media that ought to be holding them to account are all in fear of their jobs. And if, as an investigative journalist, you get too close to, I don't know, the Jeffrey Epstein case a few years ago, or Prince Andrew and so on, well, you're either found dead or you're silenced or you're sacked. Or the 9/11 case, why is there a complete silence about what happened on 9/11? It's only alternative media that carry the story. Well, because your job is not worth anything if you start talking about that. You're regarded as whatever, a conspiracy theorist. So it's incredible. The 9/11 people have become called truthers, right? Which is really what they are. They just want the truth. And therefore they've set up various organizations to try and get the truth. I mean, truth has become the greatest scarcity on this planet. We're dying as a planet, not from lack of water, not from lack of money, not from lack of anything, but actually just lack of truth. And politics, therefore, has become, a business about the suppression of truth. So what's my counter-strategy? Okay, so what I'm saying, and I've set up a campaign against political lying in this last week, watching all this horror show in Parliament, watching the fact that finally we had a Supreme Court prepared to say, no, hang on, this Prime Minister lied to his Queen. The inference is there. He prorogued Parliament for false reasons. Obviously it was to push his hard Brexit through. And the Supreme Court, 11-0, found against him. Now that to me is a shocking and scandalous situation. We have a Prime Minister prepared to misuse his powers, including advising the Queen, on a lie. He was stopped by the Supreme Court, Parliament's reassembled, and will be meeting again tomorrow, Monday, and hopefully the rest of the week, and can hopefully find some way out of this nightmare that we've ended up with liars literally running the government. Dominic Cummings is another person we know has lied. He worked for these campaigning organisations that were behind the 2016 pro-Brexit referendum result and used lies literally to advance their case. And of course his argument is, well, so what? Everybody lies. Yes, I lied because I believed in Brexit and I want to take us out, and so now I'm doing everything, to do that. Well, it becomes then a sort of arrogance game. My lies will prevail over yours, because where these people are coming from is that everybody's lying all the time anyway, so it's just a matter of power. This is a real politic kind of world that Carl Schmitt, who was the lawyer in charge of the Nazi accession and maintenance of power, would recognise. There's nothing matters. There's no values. There's only power. There's only force. Ultimately, there's the power of the gun. And I don't wish to associate or live in a society where the Carl Schmitts of the world, the Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnsons, are seen to be getting away with what they're doing. And I take my hat off to the Supreme Court for having the intellectual robustness to deliver a sound verdict and to uphold the law. And as they pointed out, Parliament is the supreme source of law, but over and above that is the common law that we all have to obey, and statute law. And ultimately is the law of reason, I would say, as Cicero pointed out in his study of the philosophy of law, and as great jurists and legal thinkers have done ever since. Law comes from, ultimately, the laws of God, the laws of the divine, which is a metaphysical origin. I'm with Kelsen and other philosophers of law that argue that human law originates in divine law, ultimately, or the law of reason, or however you want to call it. So this is all set at nothing if politicians can get away with lying, as Boris Johnson thinks he obviously can, even up to and including his Queen. And so what I've done is I've set up this campaign against political lying. You can find it on a website, just Google that, and or email me. And it's promoting the idea that if each parliament in democratic states could pass a bill requiring legislators to speak the truth on the floor of the House, whether in the Lords or the Senate or the Commons or wherever, and if they're found to lie, then they lose office. It's a sackable offence. They're no longer an MP or a Lord. They lose office immediately. Now you might say, well, hang on, there'd be very few people left. Well, so let's have a turnaround of some of these corrupt old people that are blocking, as Christ said, they're not behaving properly, and yet they're blocking the entrance to the kingdom of God. They're not letting people process through on their initiatory journeys, so to speak. I believe there's enough people of virtue in Britain who would step up and become MPs and Lords and so on, and take their responsibilities seriously and tell the truth. Now, I've called it the campaign against political lying in a negative sense. I explain it on the website because truth is a complex and variable concept. Philosophers have been studying what is truth for millennia, ever since the first philosophers began, and before that. And different people can have different views. I mean, you can get up in Parliament and be very fiercely pro-Brexit, like some of these Tories are, and you can be very fiercely pro-Remain, and they both think they're telling the truth. So I don't think you can require politicians to tell the truth as the primary thing, in legislation, because they'll say, well, I am. What you can do is require them not to lie. So in the legislation that I formulated, and I've made public now, it's called the Parliamentary Duty of Veracity Bill, and it's a campaign to prevent politicians lying. And the details, the wording is set out. I think it's just common sense. When I was younger, first beginning to take an interest in politics and watching television programmes of debates, well, we didn't see Parliament debates, but we saw politicians being interviewed in the days of Harold Wilson and Ted Heath. One assumed that politicians told the truth. They might have different views, but they told the truth. Well, obviously they don't. We know that now. And I think this should be a criminal offence, and they should be sacked. So that's one thing I've been doing. And if that were true, I think it would transform the whole situation. I actually think that Parliament should pass such a law in this coming week. If if I had the ear of the appropriate people in Parliament, I would suggest they rush this legislation through in emergency fashion. We're not going to solve the problems with Brexit and the constitutional crisis we're facing until people start being required to tell the truth. Okay, so how deep does this go? Because according to my analysis, the whole Brexit narrative that the Tory party were trumpeting in Parliament, Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, and Boris Johnson and so on, and then other MPs getting up, they literally believe that Brexit is the truth. It's become a sort of obsession in their minds, and they believe they're the honourable and virtuous ones, and that therefore they have a duty to pass this legislation or to take us out on October 31st. They so strongly believe that this is true that they're prepared to break the law, to bend the law, to twist, to turn, to whatever, in order to get their way. And also, they're prepared to demonise anyone that stands against them, like poor old leader of the Labour Party is getting hammered by them and insulted, just because he dares to say, no, hang on, this isn't acceptable. And so Jeremy Corbyn gets lambasted violently, verbally, by Boris Johnson as if he's the devil incarnate. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn is anything like that. He's a humble, older man who deserves a bit more respect. Boris Johnson doesn't understand the first thing about respect, with all due respect. But what I want to do here is deconstruct this narrative of we the Brexiteers are telling the truth, because with all due respect, philosophically, and I think A.C. Grayling and other philosophers will back me on this, this whole narrative is a lie constructed on a lie constructed on a lie. And if we'd have had, people of sufficient intellectual depth and integrity in Parliament, they would have seen this through and done something about it years ago. Firstly, we were told the foundational lie right at the beginning by David Cameron in setting up the parameters of this referendum. We, the British people, were never told this was a legally binding referendum. We looked at the Act and it said it was advisory, right? So Parliament could do what it wanted with the results of the referendum. Now, David Cameron said, no, we're going to abide by it. But those words had no legal force. They were simply, a milkman saying, yes, it's the best milk. Yes, I'm giving you the gold top today. Whereas actually they're watering it down. There's no requirement of truth and veracity in those words by David Cameron. And yet, everyone treats the 2016 referendum as sacrosanct and inviolable and legally binding. Now that's the first lie we were told. It didn't dawn on us until, well, it dawned on me really about 2 days after the referendum when I saw Theresa May assume the office of Prime Minister and insist in her strident way that yes, that was the will of the people, she was going to do Brexit. No ifs, buts, caveats, nothing, just that's it, we're doing it. And because I was living in Scotland, because I knew the mood of the Scottish people, because I'm an internationalist and chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, and I've lived in Wales and all parts of the UK for many years, and taught throughout, I knew with a heavy heart immediately that this would be the breakup of the United Kingdom, if she would stick to that line, and that the Scottish people would never accept in a million years, the vast majority of them, Brexit on those terms. They'd voted against it. I also knew the people of Northern Ireland wouldn't accept it because they'd voted against it. And what I found incredible on like day 2 after the referendum was the arrogance of this English politician who I'd met. I'd met Theresa May. She's a sort of typical middle-of-the-road, semi-intelligent conservative with not very much life experience and not much ethical depth. I mean, I met her when I was teaching religious studies in an all-girl Anglican school in Wiltshire, and she addressed the Sixth Form Politics Club. And, I was utterly disappointed with the woman and her complete lack of foresight about what she was doing. That policy was going to destroy the United Kingdom. Now, I saw that with a blinding flash of realisation and a sinking feeling. How could a politician act in such a stupid way? And her kind of line of reasoning seemed to be that if we repeat often enough that this is what we're doing, there's nothing but this, we are doing this, then suddenly she'll be able to brainwash everybody into thinking that's the truth. But the whole premise that it was based on was a lie. If she'd have got up humbly and said, well, gosh, the great responsibility of being Prime Minister has been thrust on me, I don't really know what to do about this Brexit referendum because, gosh, the people of Scotland voted against, people of Northern Ireland did, and if we push it through, they're going to be very upset and probably leave the UK. We don't want that, do we? And not all of the people of England voted for it, after all. The people of London and many, many cities, Brighton, Oxford, Cambridge, all the intellectual powerhouses of our country were against it. So I'm not quite sure what to do about this, and after all, it was only advisory, and so I think I'm going to think about this for a few months. We'll have debates in Parliament, we'll see if we can get national consensus, and we'll see if there's a way forward. I'll be consulting the Scottish Government, the Northern Ireland Assembly, and, etc., etc. And I don't know what to do. If she'd have got up and said that, with all honesty and candour, she'd have been telling the truth. And the people would have, been brought on board the process. I think that eventually what would have happened, what should have happened, is out of that process of consultation and discussion would have eventually dawned that probably we need a second referendum about this, because that first one was only advisory. As more information was beginning to come out about the horrors of what it would be like to actually leave in this way, eventually a second referendum would have appeared the most logical and the most ethical solution. But no, she didn't say that. She got up in her most arrogant and increasingly arrogant mendacity and kept pumping out the lie that this is what we're going to do because that's what the British people voted for. Well, that was a lie. Even in the 2016 referendum, the vast majority of the British people who were registered electors did not vote for leaving the EU. They either didn't vote because for various reasons, or they voted to remain. And the margin was very, very small. And the voice of the people who'd abstained, in my opinion, does count. By not voting, they actually are voting for the status quo. Because if you're too apathetic to vote, it means you're happy with the current setup. So that's the truth. But the truth has become, as I say, the shortest and most absent commodity in Parliament and in politics these days. So instead, Theresa May got away with her lies, and she brainwashed the fellow travellers of the Tory right into trumpeting that constantly. I think the Labour Party made a huge mistake in not exposing that from the very beginning, and Corbyn's leadership was lacking in robust ethical confrontation of this lie right from day one. He should have got up in Parliament and said, no, this was an advisory referendum. He was mistaken to vote for Article 50 being pushed through. And the Labour Party was mistaken to have supported that. I think the Liberal Democrats realised from very, very early on that it was a disaster. But even they, at that time, fell for this line that, well, yes, that's what people voted for, and so we have to do it. So truth was the first and primary casualty of that 2016 referendum. The whole way it was set up was mendacious. The campaigning that went on among the Vote Leave lot was mendacious. And the victory is therefore a lie constructed on a lie. And then, so in order to heal this, we have to, as a surgeon of philosophy, let's call me a doctor of intellectual surgery, we have to excise that lie from the body politic. We have to restore the healthy facts of truth that the 2016 referendum was advisory only, and that all the tragedies that have occurred in the UK since this lie has been adopted as the football chant of the Tory party and parties to the right, the Brexit Party, the UKIP, whatever you want, they keep changing their name. All the various fascist, extreme right-wing thugs that inhabit that terrain have adopted this slogan, Brexit's the will of the people, it will be enforced. I'm sorry, the whole thing is a lie, constructed on a lie, constructed on a lie. And the only way to heal it is to, as I say, exercise some intellectual surgery and bring back the truth that it was advisory and that it is definitely against the interests and best wishes and common interests of the nation of the UK as a whole. That truth needs to be spoken loudly in Parliament. I don't think it's being spoken loudly enough. I mean, there are people on the Labour benches, and particularly on the Lib Dem benches, and the Green, and the SNP, and everyone who's got a brain, and also in the moderate Conservative Party, they've now come round and realised that Brexit is a nightmare. Well, that's what you get when you base policy on lies. So it's very interesting. Let's hope that this coming week enough decent politicians come round and vote. I think this man Boris Johnson needs to be voted out of office. And I believe that then Parliament has the right to elect an alternative Prime Minister. Because the Prime Minister is the person that commands the majority of MPs in the Commons, by law. Boris Johnson doesn't, and he could lose that vote. Now, I think that the MPs then have a time to elect an alternative leader, and I hope that they do. I personally don't really care who it is. I think the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, should be offered that role because his party commands the biggest chunk of opposition. But, I wouldn't mind if it was offered to Ian Blackford, who's a very articulate and moral person, it seems to me, from the SNP benches. Perhaps they could agree on that. The Lib Dems seem to have a problem with Jeremy Corbyn. Since it's only a temporary thing, I don't see the issue myself, but then I'm not a politician. Let them agree somebody. And the bullying tactics and behaviour of Jeremy Corbyn, his response to these fine Labour and Lib Dem women getting up and describing their receiving death threats and so on, and rudeness from the public by standing for Remain, is, I think, shocking and shows that Boris Johnson is prepared to pander to the lowest common denominator of British society. He's become a spokesperson for this deceit, which has now become a political movement. His dismissal of their complaints as humbug, I think, just shows total lack of sympathy, lack of heart. The man lacks morality, it seems to me. And this is a tragedy unfolding in front of our eyes. So if we can find a way to restore truth to our parliamentary chambers at different levels, this is the first, the non-lying, right? You don't literally lie and say, no, I wasn't in New York, I didn't give a speech at the UN, when everybody can see he did. That's a lie, you can prove it scientifically. But then the higher degrees of truth require tolerance, humility, intellectual acuity, insight, and so on. I would like to see our politicians have more of that. Instead of this sort of arrogant insistence that their own position is the only and absolute truth, when it is premised and based on lies. This is what I find so shocking. So there's more I could say about this. It seems to me that the culture of lying is part of what I call Sophiaphobia. It's a medical condition. I've talked about the Conservative Party has become a kind of death cult, peddling Brexit like a religious obsession. This is an idea that Dr. Ernst Becker developed in his great work, The Denial of Death, which I've spoken about before, and in which these cults peddle extreme solutions to life's predicaments, normally at the hands of a charismatic leader who takes the followers into death willingly. And the more difficult it is, the more willingly they go, because they're prepared to surrender everything. And the fact that Brexit has become a sort of death cult, leading us off the cliff into the abysm of the breakup of the UK, the chaos that can be caused by a hard Brexit. Well, they love it. They cheer for it more and more because it's self-destruction. And that's ultimately what the ego wants. What the point here is that the death cult satisfies the need for the ego to self-dissolve back into the true self. And the ego knows that. So, of course, it wants death in a paradoxical kind of way. But actually what it really wants is ego death, which is precisely what it's not doing. Instead, it's destroying society around it. You know, one senses with Boris Johnson that rather than admit he was wrong and that Brexit's actually probably not a good idea, he'd rather see the entire UK break up. He'd rather see the Tory party destroyed forever. He'd rather see, God knows what, catastrophes he'd be happy to do in order to get his own ego's way. And Geoffrey Cox and others in the Conservative Party are the same. They're egomaniacs who instead of humbly asking contritely for some higher truth to dawn, are still peddling this lie based on a lie, that Brexit is good for us. No, it's like amputation is good for us, Sadly not. If you cut off all your limbs and then your head, you die. That's what Brexit is. It's a mad amputation of every single limb and the head. And then saying, yeah, now he's cured. Anyway, so Sophiaphobia, this fear of wisdom, is ego's reaction to wisdom. It won't listen, it can't hear, it switches off, it shouts over, and it trumpets its own truths rather than listening to other truths. So, we have a problem. It's a medical problem, actually. A psychomedical problem among parliamentarians. And the only cure I can see is truth-telling. That's the point of therapy. Therapy can only happen in the intimacy of a therapeutic exchange if the patient tells the truth. And it can only happen in the hothouse that is Parliament if these parliamentarians are required to tell the truth. I mean, some of them might not talk a lot. They might be so unable to tell the truth that they literally can't speak.